Good morning, friends. Let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master, Paramahansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, humbly we bow to all. Dear friend Swami Kriyananda, bless us with deep understanding of the meaning of our Master's teachings. Help us to feel the wisdom and the power of that wisdom, and then give us the clarity and the courage to move forward into the light. Om, peace. Amen. I received a question relating to a few episodes ago, but it seemed like a question worth answering. So I think I'll just pause in my reading of the festival and just talk about it. It was related to the episode in which I was talking about human potential, what our real human potential is, and how few souls on the planet even know what that real what the real rules of the game are, and how many fewer of us are able to actually rise and be victorious. A lot of us can make progress toward that victory, but the absolute victory that's promised by the fourth stage, the redemption from all delusion, is not simple. So the question I was asked, which is a pretty obvious question, how do we actually shift and see life completely differently? And that, of course, is the whole question of the spiritual path. It's when Master came to America in 1920. In 1920, we weren't a global village by any means. No internet, no email, no. You had telephone, but you could have these. I mean, conceivably a telephone. I'm not quite sure when things were invented. But even when I was a child, long-distance phone calls were this huge thing, and international calls were just a stunning thing to do, and it was terribly expensive. And when fax machines came in and you could actually send paper back and forth and communicate in real time, it was just, a total revolution. So in 1920, when Yogananda, the first boat that left India after World War I had finished, Yogananda came over to Boston, and he landed there. And when he got on the boat, he had both a beard and long hair. But other Indians on the boat who were more familiar with America advised him that one or the other he could handle. But if he came to America with both, it just would be too exotic and too much of a shock. People at that time, men didn't often wear beards even at that time. So the long hair, his guru had told him to wear his hair long. So he kept his hair long, but the hair can be an antenna which draws energy. It's actually interesting. Some yogis shave their heads because they just want to live solitary without relationship to the world around them, which is a valid spiritual approach. Or they wear their hair long and then they interact with all the energies of the universe around them. Given Yogananda's mission as an avatar to transform society, the long hair was the appropriate one for him. So he kept his hair long throughout his life, although he would pull it back like this and knot it and kind of tuck it under. So you really couldn't see that it was long. When Swami Kriyananda had long hair, he also often did that. Master's hair was very thick and curly. Swami's was very thin and straight, so it was not as much of an entity for Swami even when it was loose. But in any case, when Master arrived, he was so exotic. And he also faced a certain amount of prejudice because his skin was dark. People perceived him as being African rather than Indian. But these are all the things that he faced. However, and the teachings that he was bringing of Sanatana Dharma, which is the universal truth and the principle of self-realization, which is the foundation stone of all true religions, all of this was totally new. It's very important to understand how much in 100 years our society, Our world has completely transformed because technology has united us, and Dwapara Yuga is rising. It started in 1900, and started proper in 1900. The transition started 200 years earlier. All of which is to say, Master had a real job in front of him to get the point across, to get us to see life in a totally new way. There were, of course, threads where people were looking. Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson were very steeped in the Indian teachings. Theosophy, Annie Besant, there were many exceptions, but not like now. So Master took the teachings that he came to bring, which was thousands and thousands and thousands of years of tradition, which had now been overgrown with rituals and dogmas and all these things, which is essentially Hinduism, much as Christianity has been overgrown with rituals and dogmatism and so on. And he came to cut away all that overgrowth and just get both religions down to their essential point. And above all, what he wanted was, Master, was not the presentation of some vast esoteric reality that no one could relate to. The way he wanted to prune the overgrowth was to return spiritual responsibility to the individual and make even the most transcendent ideas comprehensible to everyone, to the average person. Now, true Sanatana Dharma, which is the eternal religion, is not something that requires an institution, a priest, a scripture, a ritual, none of that. It's the way we're made. And another definition of Sanatana Dharma, besides the eternal religion, is that which is. It was not invented, it was perceived. It was a revelation within the human heart, within the human mind, about the nature of existence and the creation that we find ourselves in. And it is entirely dependent upon individual experience and can only be understood by individual experience. So Master wanted to prune away everything and just present something that anybody could comprehend. So he wrote a little booklet, or actually had one of his disciples write it, because Master was not yet as fluent in English as he became. Later he wrote in English on his own, but in 1920, when he himself was, 27 years old, and coming to America for the first time, he was just starting. So a disciple named Yogananda wrote that book. I mentioned it because Swami later rewrote the book and called it God is for Everyone. The version that Master published in 1920 and presented to his American audiences was called The Science of Religion. And Master was also trying to say, look, this is not a dogma. Religion itself is not a dogma. It's a science. And what science means is that you can prove it by experiment. It's not something you take on faith. You prove it by experiment. Now, of course, you have to have some faith in what you're experimenting with, or else you wouldn't even bother. If you didn't think it was worth anything, you wouldn't look at it. So there's an element of, I think this might be true, so now I'm going to conduct the experiment and find out if it is true. And Master reduced the science of religion down to the simplest possible thoughts. Every sentient being, every being that has enough consciousness to be aware of itself sufficiently, has two impulses. One is to escape suffering, and the other is to increase happiness. Now, what we think of as suffering, what we perceive as happiness, what we perceive as our potential for suffering, for happiness, how much suffering we can endure, you can see just in the human world there's vast differences of opinion. When you go down to the worms and the fishes and the puppies and the dolphins, but even just the desire to survive, the desire to find food, the desire to kill if necessary in order to eat, all of that is to alleviate suffering and to find what we call happiness. Even happiness is just, for a tiger, killing a small animal and feasting on it. Whereas for a human being, We wouldn't chase down and kill a small animal and tear it apart with our teeth. We're not made that way to do it, but we do other things that we think bring us happiness and cause us to avoid suffering. No, people don't think of that as religion. They think of prayer and, and all these other things and avatars and gurus as religion. But why does anybody follow any of those things? Because on some level, it satisfies this fundamental need to escape happiness, to escape suffering and find happiness. Funny, I keep switching those words around. But anyway, that's the premise of it. Okay? So the way that we gradually transform our entire perception of reality is by one simple word: experience. And what gives us experience, and this is the question, how do we transform? Well, we transform slowly, because we don't give up a commitment, an idea, a habit, a desire, a longing, until we have become persuaded that perhaps what we thought was going to give us happiness actually is causing us suffering. And the effort to change our understanding of reality is less painful than the pain of continuing in that false reality. And it's a tipping point. And if one thinks back, and see, now this is where the genius of the way Master presented it, and I have to give Swami Kriyananda extraordinary credit in this, no matter how grand the idea, Swamiji had a genius for bringing it down to something that we ourselves had actually experienced, and therefore could at least verify the basic principle, not because someone said so, but because of our own experience. Now, I have to remind you that in the scientific method, if a person is going to devote themselves to a series of experiments, whatever they might be, it's because somewhere there is some kind of intuitive belief that it's worth conducting the experiment because the theory that I'm testing has a likelihood of being true. Now, how that scientist comes to that intuitive understanding, how the truth seeker comes to that intuitive understanding, part of that is just the mystery of life itself. But even if it's mysterious as to its origins, it's still verifiable by experience. Now, in the context of what I present to all of you, I am a long-time committed devotee of Master, of Yogananda, and of Kriyananda. And I have often spoken of the fact that I trust what they say. That doesn't mean I always understand it or even agree with it, but I have a fundamental trust. I have had enough experience, and part of that experience, well, with Swami Kriyananda, it was past lives is the only possible explanation. Because as soon as I saw him, I trusted him completely, and I've never wavered in that. It's been, thank you God, a freedom that I've had, that I've never questioned his essential integrity and essential wisdom. I've struggled at times with certain specifics. I wouldn't even use the word struggle, but certain specifics sometimes I've just had to put on the shelf because I didn't understand them. Although year by year by year, I don't think there's anything left on that shelf now. If there is, it's not much, because as my life experience has increased, the validity of what he told me, which I was simply not mature enough to understand. But you see, even when I didn't understand it, I didn't dare reject it either. I just had to put it aside until it clarified itself, because my fundamental experience of his wisdom and the truth of what he said was too strong. So in our human life, the question, how do we come to see life in a totally different way? Something awakens within us, and something tips the balance between suffering and happiness. I'll use drug addiction as a very, very good example, but drugs are just a dramatic example of the kind of misunderstandings that we have. Drug addiction, per se, is a manifestation of what Sanatana Dharma speaks of as three essential delusions. One of them is the desire for money, which is actually the desire for power. Money gives power, is what people see. There's the desire for sensual experience, which is generally represented as sexuality, but it's the entire thought that I will find pleasure by indulging my physical appetites, whatever they might be, that happiness comes through physical experience. And the third one is, if I suffer, if I can dull my consciousness, then I will be happier. And that's intoxicants. So we often call this wine sexuality. Wine meaning intoxicants, sexuality, and money. But these are more subtle thoughts than that. But intoxicants is the idea that if I dull my consciousness, rather than rise to meet the challenge and expand my consciousness so that I can see it in perspective and move through it with courage, instead I will dull my consciousness. Now people can take drugs, they can drink alcohol, they can watch television, they can indulge in a great deal of sexuality, they can just use their physical bodies and go kind of crazy in their physical bodies, whatever they're doing, but just tons of physical experiences. You can watch television, you can sleep, and all of it, or you can just be dull. Just be dull. People will ask you questions and you're just dull. You don't have enough energy even to think about it. It's more, I suffer less if I just don't think. And you see people all around who are just like that. You bring up a serious idea to them and they just aren't interested. Because I love serious ideas, I've learned that a lot of people just aren't interested. It's just as simple as that. Okay, but drug addiction, you start out because it makes you feel better. How many people who end up with addictions of various kinds, perhaps you hear this a lot from adolescents. It's just like I was very uncomfortable. I never felt good around other people. If I drank a little bit, 12, 13, 14-year-olds will tell you this. If I drink a little bit, suddenly I'm at ease. I'm not so nervous. And then you discover heavier, harder drugs, and you find that dulling my consciousness seems to alleviate my suffering. But gradually, the addiction, the physical illnesses that result, the chaos in your relationships, all of the things that happen, you suffer more from that. You get more suffering than happiness. And then you are inspired to change. And often the change is very difficult, but the suffering of continuing as you are is greater than the perceived pain of making the effort to change. And that's how we gradually transform our perception of the universe. It's not, yes, occasionally you'll have some transcendental experience. In my early years on the path through the 60s, some of those experiences were drug-induced, oddly, psychedelic infusion. And people who became addicted to the psychedelic experience, the drug experience, gradually found that did not really give them what they wanted. But for some people, it was the drama of the sudden perception of the world being different. And I've heard recently that they're experimenting with psilocybin, which is LSD, for treating people with PTSD. And they're finding that the suddenness of that change of perception about the nature of reality, at least I've read, has had a very positive effect on their perception of reality. So these sudden experiences, and I'm not advocating drugs by any means, I'm just speaking of how a sudden experience can change your perception. And it can come through meditation, it can come through being out in the country, it can come out in nature, it can come through the birth of your first child, it can come from falling in love, it can come from a near-death experience, where all of a sudden the actual the Maya parts, the veil parts, and one actually sees through the veil. And at least for that moment of time, you realize, oh my gosh, it's nothing. Life is nothing that I thought it was. And of course, these near-death experiences are really changing people. The whole point of life itself, death itself, it's something else. So there can be that sudden shift. But more what happens is, I don't know, it's like something ripens within us. Spirituality is a seed. It's like a mustard seed, as Jesus says in the Bible. But I often hold the apple seed in my hand. I eat a lot of apples, and apple seeds are very pretty. And I happen to have a couple of small apple trees near my house. And sometimes the apples I eat, I pick from those trees. And I look at that seed, and I look out at the tree, and I think it's all in there. You know, where do it hide? You know, how do it know? And of course, conditions have to be right for that seed to turn into an apple tree. But the potential is inherent. That's you and me. The potential to reach the fourth stage of perfect understanding, it's all in us. How do it know? I don't know how it knows, but it knows. But it grows like a seed. And just like that apple seed cannot go from being a seed to a tree. And see, that's the question. How do we see the world completely differently? Well, that's not how it happens. Understanding grows like a seed. As I said, there are certain exceptions, but not many. And many people exaggerate the change. I mean, they have an experience that makes a big impression on them, but it doesn't necessarily result in permanent transformation, because it has to grow like a seed. That seed has to be soaked. That seed has to split. The tiniest little bit of a bud is going to begin to come out of it. A little tiny leaf, you know, very fragile little stem. You know, gradually, if you're very careful, it'll get to be a little bit more like a stick. Just, you know, on and on. You can trace it all the way through. It's easy to imagine. But it will result in a tree. That's how we become a tree. We have an experience. Now, how do we actually do that? We must be motivated, we must be honest, and we must put out a lot of energy. We have to be honest in our actual experience. When, again, this would have been the early 70s, when the whole world was coming, the world that I lived in was just all morality and everything was shifting, and sexual freedom was just a big deal that was happening at that time. And Swami was a monk, and he represented a very orthodox teaching. But some young people in America, in San Francisco, what do you think about the sexual revolution? That's the word I was looking for. He said, well, the positive side of it, and people expected a rather moralistic answer from him, but he said, the positive side of it is people are making their own experience the criteria for their behavior and their life decisions. And he said, following your own experience, he said, is the way to freedom, for all the reasons I've just been talking about, provided you are honest about your experience. You see, what traps us in delusion is that we start out to prove we are biased in favor of a certain theory, and we only accept the evidence that supports our theory. Now, if you were thinking about a scientist in a lab, that would be silly. It's like if he's trying to find out what's true in order to invent something or to have a deeper understanding of the laws of the universe, you have to be rigidly honest about your experience. But bias is what people work with all the time. In fact, I had this conversation with friends. One of them was a research scientist at, God bless it, Stanford University, which is our neighbor here. And the person, I won't even say their gender, was very distressed because they had gotten a grant to do, they weren't in pure sciences, they were in the social sciences, had gotten a grant to do this, to prove this certain point, and the evidence was going the other way, and the person was extremely upset, and it was causing a lot of grief, so they invited me, and we were talking. I'm laughing now because, I mean, I'm not stupid, but I'm not part of that world. And she, now I've told it, she was explaining all this with a great deal of grief. So I said, now, let me get this clear. You got a grant to conduct an experiment to find out if a certain premise was true, and you're finding out whether or not that premise is true. That's what you're doing. You're fulfilling the intention of your research, right? She said, yes. I said, and that's a catastrophe, apparently. She said, yes. I said, excuse me. And then I just turned my head and laughed. Like, How crazy is this? But in fact, you know, she had to prove that what she thought was true. Not, nobody cared about the truth. They all just cared about their own egos and their own careers. It's a crazy world. It's a super crazy world. Great scientists. There's some famous archaeologist who had all these theories about, and became very famous for all his theories. And he was on an archaeological dig, and you're digging into these stratas, and he found an artifact that was entirely misplaced according to his theories, and he couldn't resist it. He put it into the strata where he thought it, where his whole career was based on saying it had to belong. Of course, he was found out and he was shamed and it was awful. But you see, our egos get involved. And I mean, we're not talking great scientists or research grants at Stanford. We're just talking ordinary life. Just recently, I was in a conversation with someone, and I had given a Sunday service, and I made reference to the fact that we've had millions of incarnations. I can't verify that from my own experience. That's what Yogananda says. That's what Sanatana Dharma says, that we've had millions of incarnations. It takes a very, very long time. This person I was talking to basically said, well, they could accept that maybe you had 15 or 20. I said, you're just totally making that up. You don't have any basis for saying that. You just don't want what I said to be true, so you're just making up another reality. And they were relaxed enough to just laugh and admit that they were. You know, in this case, it was amusing, but it's not amusing. It's not even slightly amusing. We do it all the time. We are afraid of what's true. So how do you accept a completely different perception? You start by trying to have the courage to see things as they actually are. This is Swami. Make experience the basis of your understanding of life, but you must be honest about your experience. And so the real quest is this constant, introspection. This constant drive for true self-understanding. And you start with a theory that intuitively you have some reason to believe is true. When I first heard about reincarnation, I was a Jewish girl from Texas. What did I know about reincarnation in 60 something? But that's very interesting. And intuitively, I just became intrigued by it. So for a number of years afterwards, I just applied it as a theory to situations that I otherwise found inexplicable. And gradually, over time, my common sense, my experience, and my intuition, and I studied. I didn't just, oh, well, it must be 15 or 20, because that's an easier number for me to grasp. I went to the sources, and I studied, and I studied, and I thought, and I reflected. And I didn't mindlessly accept, but I also trusted my own experience when I was conducting an experiment honestly enough. So that's what we have to ask ourselves. What is really happening? And I've been in situations where I've had strong reactions to something. And then I have to ask myself, are circumstances really causing the way I feel? Or is it my reaction to these circumstances that's causing the way I feel? I mean, these are just obvious questions. But to recapitulate just the simple thing, how do we change our entire perception of the world? Very slowly, but by conscientious, determined effort, and the word is truth seeker. To be willing to forego even our most cherished preconceptions out of one desire, which is simply to understand what is. That's why Sanatana Dharma, the overarching truth of all spiritual teachings, the definition I love, that which is. What causes suffering? What causes happiness? And how can I move toward happiness, which is, say, moving toward the divine bliss, moving toward the light. God bless you, my friend.